Radio.
Alchemy Radio. Alchemy Radio. Alchemy Radio. Analyze. Conceive. Believe. Are you tuned in?
Welcome to Alchemy Radio, where the only thing we ask of you is to keep an open mind. And we've an extremely interesting show lined up for you today, because it's my great pleasure to welcome Ian R. Crane onto the show. Ian is an ex-oilfield executive who now lectures and writes and broadcasts on the geopolitical webs that are being spun pretty much all over the world. And Ian primarily focuses his attention and research on the geopolitical arena, but has a big personal interest in folklore and mythology and ancient belief systems and indigenous cultures and that kind of thing. So I'm very pleased to welcome him onto the show to discuss that and much more. Ian R. Crane, how are you?
John, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
You're more than welcome. The pleasure's all mine. And indeed, speaking of pleasures, not so many pleasures going on in the world with regard to our financial system and that kind of thing. A lot of doom and gloom being talked about and spoken about in the press, be it national, international, or through any of the media. Ian, in very broad terms, what's your take on the global financial situation in a nutshell? Can you give it to me in one or two sentences, maybe?
A deliberately contrived global financial collapse to bring about the destruction of the middle classes and move the majority of the wealth into a very small amount of bank accounts.
Why, Ian?
Why? It's very simple. I mean, the agenda is about total control. It's not about money, because those who perpetrate the agenda have all the money that they could ever dream of wanting. And they have the capability to basically create it out of thin air anyway, due to them controlling the fractional reserve banking system. So this is about power. Let me use this very simple analogy. John, have you ever played a game of Monopoly?
Many times.
Right. Have you ever finished a game of Monopoly?
Yes, but normally because I cheat.
Ah, exactly. Well, exactly. And when you finished the game of Monopoly, what was the sort of state of play at that point?
Well, the state of play, assuming things go the way I want them to, basically I own the board. I own everything on that board. I mean, I control the world, or the Monopoly world.
There you go. You see, you're a budding globalist already.
Don't call me that.
No, but you have just described exactly what's occurring in the real world. You know, now you are one of the very few people who have actually finished a game of Monopoly. I mean, the vast majority of people don't get that far. You know, they start playing, say, on the day after Christmas.
Yep.
With the family, and after about sort of 3 days at it, eventually, if there's not been any fistfights, everybody eventually agrees to sort of call it a day, and they simply add up whatever it is that they've got in terms of property and cash, and then whoever's got the most is declared the winner. But of course, that is not the purpose of the game. What you have just described is absolutely the purpose of the game. It is total ownership of the board. It is the annihilation of every one of the opponents. Well, that's exactly what's occurring in the real world right now. It is about total control of the board. And right now, the socio-psychopathic global corporatists are literally in the final round. I mean, they have managed to achieve total ownership of Greece.
So when you say that, Ian, you're talking about the banks, the banking system, the big companies, that kind of thing?
Well, I'm talking about certainly the banks are the mechanics that help to bring this about. And of course, the primary bank is Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
A guy called Alessio Rastani famously said on a BBC interview last September, governments don't rule the world, Goldman Sachs rules the world. Well, he's not strictly correct, but I don't think he necessarily intended to be factually correct. But he was absolutely on the money, as it were, when it comes to identifying the mechanics, i.e. those who are effectively assigned to carry out the agenda of those who sit in the shadows and are effectively playing their game of Monopoly. And Goldman Sachs is headed up by a chief executive officer, a guy called Lloyd Blankfein, who famously said in an interview about 3 years ago that he felt he was doing God's work. Well, God's work by sort of literally bringing the vast majority of the world into a state of austerity and poverty and economic misery may be his wet dream, but it ain't exactly the aspiration of millions of people all around the world. And by the way, it also needs to be acknowledged that Goldman Sachs have rewarded Lloyd Blankfein very, very handsomely over the period, because we are now in the 5th year of the global financial collapse, and in that period since the collapse began, Lloyd Blankfein has earned the princely sum of $183 million.
And you say the 5th year in, would that in itself that's the first time I've actually heard it in such blunt terms. It's what, 4 or 5 years since this
it is
whole
the 5th
crisis.
Year. We are in the 5th year. It's 4.5 years.
Well, surely that's a message. Surely that should tell us something. I mean, maybe if we were, I don't know, a year into it, we could think governments are obviously trying to do something about this, our banking system is trying to do something about it. But I mean, after 5 years, things seem to be worse, not better.
John, you're absolutely spot on. I mean, if we were in the 5th week or the 5th month, you could give the governments and the media and the bankers maybe a little bit of leeway and say, well, they didn't really see it coming and they're still trying to get a grip on, what actually occurred and put the mechanism in place to bring about a recovery. Yep. But it's the 5th year. And all you're getting from governments and from the financial community is basically constant untruths. No, let me be even more frank. Outright lies, deceit and obfuscation. Basically, the intention is to remove all financial freedom from the masses. So you'll notice that all of those in politics and in finance are still very, very well rewarded. I mean, when you hear Irish politicians talking about austerity, and even recently, I heard that one of the Irish politicians basically made an observation that people must be prepared to earn less. Yep. But you're not going to see the politicians doing this anytime soon. And, when you look at the pensions that politicians award themselves, so that even when they get kicked out of office, they are never, ever going to experience austerity. So this is literally one rule for the masses and one rule for those who have literally sold their soul to perpetrate an agenda that sort of borders on genocidal. Now, Ireland right now is in an almost identical situation to that which it was in 1799. Mm-hmm. At that point, the Irish nation was so indebted, financial debt, to the London banks that eventually the Irish government saw no option except to dissolve the Irish Parliament and literally go into the dissolution of the nation. And so that was in 1800, the Act of the Union was signed, which effectively handed Ireland over to the British. And at that point, of course, the British landowners came in, they bought up the land at rock bottom prices. And 40 years later, of course, we had the travesty, which is recorded as the Irish potato famine. But in reality, there was no famine.
Well, yeah, from my own point of view, as somebody who has a keen interest in Irish history, to me, and these are strong terms and many people might disagree with me, it's just my personal opinion, it's akin to genocide as opposed to famine.
It was genocide. It was deliberate genocide by the British. There's absolutely no doubt about that, because thanks to Raymond Crotty, I have all of the shipping manifests that record the produce that was shipped out of Irish harbours during the period of the so-called famine. And what was happening was the British landowners were shipping out all the agricultural produce to sell elsewhere in the British Empire at enormous profit, of course, leaving the Irish people to effectively starve because there was indeed a blight on the potato, and the British landowners had effectively forced the Irish population to live off this diet of potato. And when the potato was blighted, they didn't even think about saying, well, okay, we'll actually allocate 20% of the arable produce or 20% of meat produce to the people of Ireland. No, the Irish people either died or emigrated, which of course was exactly what they wanted. Now, move the clock forward, because here we are, not even it was 212 years later. 212 years later, and we're looking at literally history repeating itself. And of course, this time it's not the British, it's the globalist. And in this situation, I mean, ostensibly it's the EU, the European Central Bank and the IMF acting on behalf of the socio-psychopathic corporate globalists. And what's happening here is Ireland has been specifically targeted, in my opinion, because Ireland has the potential to be the wealthiest nation in Western Europe.
I couldn't agree more.
I mean, it's, you know, first of all, it has enormous agricultural capabilities. And in fact, Raymond Crotty, who I will keep referencing because, in my opinion, he was the guy who had the most foresight and the most vision as to what was happening. I mean, he was a Kilkenny farmer. Mm-hmm. You know, and as a Kilkenny farmer, he could see that the common agricultural policy was not exactly in the best interests of either the Irish agricultural industry or the Irish people.
Yeah.
And he knew that no one was going to take any notice of a Kilkenny farmer. So he went to college as a mature student and studied agricultural economics. And in fact, he was revered by nations in South America and in the Far East because they absolutely valued what it was that he had to say regarding how a country could develop its agri-economy. But the Irish, of course, dismissed him as a maverick. And he could see what was happening back in the 1970s and 1980s. And people need to know that the referendum, now this is the fourth referendum that the Irish people have had regarding handing over sovereign power to a foreign entity.
Yeah.
And every referendum since 1987 has been due to the fact that Raymond Crotty had the courage of his convictions and he took the Irish government through the Supreme Court. And eventually, in April of 1987, he got the Irish Supreme Court to rule that it was illegal for any Irish government to hand any element of sovereign independence over to a foreign entity without a referendum of the people. And consequently, the first referendum was held in May of 87. Then, of course, we the other two we know about, which was the referendum on the EU treaty. Yeah. And because the globalists got the wrong result, then they effectively changed the name of the EU treaty to the Treaty of Lisbon. Mm-hmm. And then, in my opinion, massage the result to get the one they want. And now, I mean, Enda Kenny, you know, he's upheld the Constitution, but of course, you know, already we're hearing voices in the government saying, well, if we don't get the result that we want, then we'll just have another referendum.
That's right, Richard Bruton, incredible stuff. So basically, Ian, what you're saying to me is this slew of referenda that we have had over the last number of years, be it Nice or Lisbon, no matter how many times we've had to vote on it, and the fiscal treaty, this is to do with the cedence of power to an outside entity, for want of a better word.
Absolutely. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a referendum at all. And in fact, you know, the government in 1986 were desperately trying to get the Supreme Court to dismiss Crotty's claim that to hand power to a foreign entity was unconstitutional, because they wanted to be able to do it without the referendum. And of course, you've seen what's happened when the Greeks talked about holding a referendum back in November of last year. Yeah. Sorry, October of last year. Papandreou was basically kicked out of office, and he was replaced by Lucas Papademos. Lucas Papademos is a really interesting guy because he was head of the Greek National Bank when the National Bank was fudging the figures along with Goldman Sachs to convince the EU that it had done everything it needed to do to meet the criteria for entry into the EU. So basically, Greece was admitted into the EU under false pretenses. And Lucas Papademos is a former associate of Goldman Sachs, and he is now the unelected leader of Greece.
So the guy who got them into the mess is the guy who's supposedly leading them out of the mess.
Well, except there's going to be elections now, and we'll see whether he manages to sort of hold on to that office. But you know, even the elections may well be, you more appropriate in a banana republic. But yeah, you're exactly right. The guy that created the mess has effectively been put in charge to bring it out. And we know that doesn't work. But and it's the same in Italy, where Mario Monti has effectively been put into the leadership role in place of Berlusconi. Now, Berlusconi obviously didn't necessarily help himself. But, once again, a former associate of Goldman Sachs is put into the leadership role to supposedly help Italy recover. But this is not, there's no intention of recovery. The game plan is simply to dig the hole so deep before the people realise that they're absolutely being condemned to lives of abject economic misery. And this is particularly the case with the young generation. And by this, I'm talking really about almost anybody under the age of 35.
Yeah.
Because, what's happened is that opportunities have been just destroyed. And, people have to be very, very creative to find ways of making a living. And if they're, unfortunately, perhaps not that creative, then they end up doing jobs that really are demeaning, that they have way more capacity and capability to contribute to society, but they end up doing jobs that, somebody's always got to do these jobs. That's not my point. But the fact is that, you've got people who are capable of technical work or economic work or even political work, but they end up sort of delivering pizzas or stacking shelves. But this is what they want. This is what they want. They're literally trying to destroy the human spirit. And, we actually have reference to this from Zbigniew Brzezinski in a book that he wrote 40-odd years ago. And, of course, Zbigniew Brzezinski is Obama's mentor. But in a book he wrote 42 years ago, it's published in 1970. It's called Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Era. And in that book, he makes a very poignant observation. He says the challenge for Western governments will be to keep their people locked into consumerist materialism, preventing them from realizing who they truly are.
So, Ian, the picture you're painting to me here now, it reminds me of something out of a movie. There's a movie I saw years ago. I think it's an old film from maybe the late 20s, by Fritz Lang, called Metropolis. And in that film, which I know is referenced in a lot of current music videos time and time again. You'll see it in Lady Gaga videos referenced, or Beyonce, all that kind of stuff. It's basically a futuristic world whereby people are bred simply to work and to consume, and they're almost stripped bare of humanity. Do you really think this is what these powers that be are trying to do?
Well, look around you. Look at the facts. Look at the evidence. What do you see? I mean, basically, we've seen. The deliberate strategy was put in place with the creation of the euro, and then with all of the fake credit pumped into the system. It was deliberately pumped in there to draw people into the debt trap, to draw people into the debt trap, to draw businesses into the debt trap, and to draw nations into the debt trap. Because once, obviously, you've got somebody in debt, then you're beholden to them. And so, consequently, with the exception of Iceland, all of these other countries are beholden to the financiers who lured them into this debt. And this is why we have this event in Dublin on Sunday, 5 days before the referendum, where we have the likes of John Perkins, the guy who was a former economic hitman, whose job was to get countries into debt. So here's a guy who absolutely knows what's going on. He can see it. He was one of the guys, who was doing this until he saw the light and decided that he needed to tell the world, what was actually occurring. But still people don't want to listen. And what's happening is, unfortunately, people know that what I'm saying is the truth, but if they're not yet in total abject misery, their attitude is, oh my God, all I've got to do is keep my head down. I've got to keep working 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, 32 days a month, 13 months a year. I've just got to keep going, keep on that hamster wheel, keep running, and maybe, just maybe, I'll get myself out of debt one day. No, you won't, because the circumstances will be contrived to ensure that you are always in debt, that you are always having to basically be an economic slave and literally give up your freedom. I mean, one of the interesting things, John, You know, when people meet each other in a sort of social capacity, what's one of the sort of first questions that normally gets asked?
Well, how are you doing, I suppose?
How are you doing? Yeah. And then from there?
What do you do? In Ireland, it's the weather, but then they'll move on to what do you do, or people seem to be almost defined by a career, job, or lack thereof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, people define themselves. What's really interesting, and it's sort of an indication of the degree of programming, is that people define themselves by what actually takes away their freedom, by what actually takes away their liberty to do what they really want to be doing, because they have to work to be able to earn the living. And, you know, unfortunately, it's an ever decreasing number of people who get to work in jobs that they really enjoy. You know, when I worked in the oil industry, I was very, very fortunate. You know, I actually, had work that I did very much enjoy. Yeah. But, you know, I recognize that today, you know, that's a real luxury. And, you know, I think, unfortunately, I can speak for all my children who are, all well educated. Yep. But not one of them is doing a job that they absolutely do. Now, one of them wasn't until recently because she was a diving instructor. Yeah. But the collapse of the economies has meant that the tourism industry has been affected, very, very badly. And so consequently, the competition for people to go diving or undertake diving tuition is so great that she can no longer make a living from it. Well, so she's a victim just the same. And by the way, her degree is in international relations and politics.
Well, there you go. And it's amazing because I think it's becoming more and more people. I'm very lucky in that I do a job that I really love as well. And however, amongst my friends, very few, those who are lucky enough to have jobs, whether you see it as lucky or not, depending on your perspective, those who are in employment they're not in the minority just yet, but it's certainly heading that way. And a lot of people are taking jobs that they're maybe overqualified for, or that they really don't want to be doing simply to make ends meet. And the attitude that seems to be seeping in over the last year or so in particular that I've noticed amongst my peer group is that, oh, well, we just have to make the best of it. We have to struggle on. We're all in the same boat together. And it's something I really disagree with, because personally, and people can say it's very easy for me to sit in my high horse and say something like this because I am doing a job that I enjoy. However, I really believe we make our own reality, and we're responsible for ourselves. And the minute that we have a mentality shift that allows, be it a corporate entity or a government or another person, to take responsibility for us, well, then we cease to be who we should be or who we are. And I've a real problem with that. But I think in this country, in Ireland at the moment, that mentality, which is being fostered by the media, in my opinion, which is constantly telling us about doom and gloom, and where it's almost become trendy to be unemployed. And I don't mean that in a blasé way or in a condescending way to anybody or a patronising way to anybody who might be unemployed, because it's not a nice state of affairs. But the way the media is currently portraying it is, well, anybody who is in any way affluent or who's making the best of things in a tricky situation, they're to be kind of begrudged or frowned upon. They're part of the minority now. So to be in with the majority and to fit in, you have to be struggling, or you have to be depressed, or there has to be doom and gloom all the time. And I really think as a collective nation, our consciousness is moving in that direction, and something has to change. And you mentioned Iceland, which is a country we hear very little about in the media in Ireland, Dean. Iceland as an example versus, say, the rest of Europe, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Spain, all these economies that seem to be crumbling before our very eyes. What can you tell me about Iceland and the model, and what happened there that was different?
Well, basically the thing that happened in Iceland needs to happen everywhere else. And Iceland should, of course, be held up as the shining example of a way to get out of this mess. Because the Icelandic economy collapsed in totality, literally just over 3.5 years ago. And towards the back end of 2008, I mean, Iceland was totally bankrupt in every sense of the word. I mean, the bankers had been basically playing, roulette. I mean, they didn't even know the rules, which is really quite incredible. And there were a number of other banks, not least the CEO of Danske Bank went over to Iceland early 2008 to try and explain to them that they were heading for absolute total meltdown if they carried on with their current strategy. And they basically booed him off stage. But a year later, of course, I mean, he was proven to be extremely prescient. The difference is that Iceland has no history of finance, has no history of banking. It's not a banking nation.
Right.
And basically, these guys jumped onto the proverbial bandwagon in the days of outrageous amounts of credit being thrown around left, right, and centre by all of the European banks, and milked it. I mean, it was literally, it was market boys. It was Del Boy on acid.
Right.
But across a whole nation's banking system. So when it collapsed, it is literally, imagine putting it into a personal situation, it's like you or me suddenly finding ourselves in a situation where we owe a whole bunch of banks literally millions of dollars, euros, pounds, whatever you want to use. And the nation as a whole just hadn't got the resources to deal with it.
Okay.
So what happened was that the government collapsed. The government had obviously lost control because the government weren't monitoring their banking system. So the government of the day is just as guilty as the the financial players. But the women of Iceland were not going to tolerate this. So the women of Iceland protested. They hit the streets. They started banging their pots and pans. And in fact, it became known as the Pots and Pans Rebellion. And when the government decided that it had to call an election, when the new government came into being, it was very, very different in construction than the previous government. Primarily, it wasn't made up of one political party. It was generally independents who had the majority. Mm-hmm. And it was mainly women. Not exclusively, but it was mainly women. And the attitude in Iceland was, and I think quite rightly, the men had really screwed it up.
Yeah.
And it was going to take the women with a completely different mindset to put it right. And that is absolutely critical and pivotal to what occurred. Because when the new government was formed, one of the first visitors that they had was the IMF. And the attitude of the women was, hang on a goddamn second. You are claiming that you're here to help us get out of the mess, but you're supposed to be the body that's monitoring the global financial community to make sure that none of this happens in the first place. So why on earth would we turn to you for help? So they basically told the IMF to go take a hike.
Excellent.
And what they did was very, very creative. Let's go back to that game of Monopoly that you wiped the board with.
Yeah.
When you started that game of Monopoly, how did the game start?
Everybody's doled out a certain amount of paper money.
Exactly. Everybody is given a set of money, not loaned, not lent.
No,
you don't borrow the money; it's given. So that's what stimulates the game. That's what primes the game. That everybody has an initial pot of cash.
Okay.
But the Icelanders, they didn't want to just sort of put a monopoly money into the economy, if you like. But what they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that people understood that one, they were in a world of hurt, and two, that they were all in this together, and that everybody needed to rally round to bring them out of this situation. So what they did was very, very creative. First of all, they sort of effectively created their own monopoly money. They called it the People's Bank of Iceland, right. Krona, which basically wasn't necessarily backed by anything other than the goodwill of the government and the people.
Okay.
It's like creating a local currency that, you all agree that it's got some value, but it's not actually backed by anything. So what they did was they got the community leaders. I hate that word, but because it smacks of common purpose. But let's say that, like the local council leaders, they got them all together and said, okay, we want all the communities to contribute to reestablishing the economy. So we need a list of projects. Now, of course, there were people that were in essential industries like fishing and farming or whatever. But, there were people who really, they were involved in finance before. Now they had nothing. So, the list of projects that got drawn up was things like, filling in potholes in the roads or painting the houses of the disabled or the elderly.
Yeah.
It was anything and everything. And basically, if people wanted to get access to this new currency, they had to work for it.
Okay.
But so the money was put into the system. No, it wasn't. Nobody owed anything for it. I mean, this is the difference with the pound and the euro. Every pound and euro in circulation, somebody somewhere owes interest on it.
Right.
But what happened in Iceland was that the money was put into the economy without anybody owing interest on it. So it stimulated their new rise from the ashes. So if businessmen did need to borrow money, they could borrow money from the People's Bank.
Yeah.
But then the interest came back to the people. It didn't go to private bankers. And basically, this is the model. This is the simple model that needs to be employed globally. Basically, it needs politicians with balls, which really doesn't exist. I mean, politicians and balls, are two terms that should never be uttered in the same phrase, basically.
I agree.
Because basically, as Thomas Sheridan will explain in his presentation at the financial terrorism event on Sunday in Stillorgan Park, basically everyone who gets into a political position is only there because they are effectively proven to be a safe pair of hands, which means that they will do as they're told.
Yes.
And that they won't show any capacity for independent thought. So what this really needs is it needs like the equivalent of a pots and pans rebellion. I mean, there's 300,000 people in Iceland, and this sort of thing is a lot easier to do with 300,000 than it is with 4.7 million or whatever. But, what it needs a sufficient number of people in Ireland to realize that what's happening here is death by the whatever it is, the 1,000 cuts. It's like boiling a frog.
Yes, I like that analogy. Explain that one to us.
Well, boiling a frog, where you put the frog in cold water and you very gently sort of turn up the heat, and the frog's swimming around thinking, oh, this is wonderful, and the water gets a little warmer, and you think, oh, this is great, nice warm bath here. Mm-hmm. But, what's happening is the frog is actually not realizing that the temperature of the water is being increased all the time, and he's effectively being boiled alive, and eventually, of course, he just dies because he's been cooked.
Whereas if you had dropped him into that boiling pan, he would have jumped out straight away.
Straight away.
Yeah.
Straight away. Well, one can argue that what happened in Iceland was a bit like that, because it literally happened overnight, because somehow the financial community and the government were concealing from the people the magnitude of the pending catastrophe. And when it happened absolutely sort of overnight. So it was a bit like the frog being dropped into the hot water and jumping straight out, and the people saying, absolutely no way are we going to be swallowing that one. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Ireland, Portugal, to a lesser extent Greece, although we'll come back to Greece in a second, but it is the slow boiling here. And these guys are not going to stop until they own everything. And what's going to happen is exactly like in the 1840s. The people with the capability to get out of the country will get out. And already you've got many, many young Irish people moving to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada. So already the country is starting to lose, its talent. I mean, Brian Lenihan, God rest his soul, but Brian Lenihan, after the budget of December 15th, 2010, actually said, we need 300,000 people to leave the country.
Incredible. I
mean, this is absurd. I mean, he had pancreatic cancer, and I think he died earlier this year.
Yeah.
But basically, for a politician, a senior politician, to state categorically that we need 300,000, and he might as well have said we need 300,000 of our best and our brightest to leave, because that's what happened. And the rest of the people, what's left are just going to be the economic slaves.
And what's the way out, Ian? Is there a way out?
Yes, there is, of course, a way out. And that's, like I've said, it's to extrapolate the model of what has happened in Iceland. Basically, the fractional reserve banking system, the total control of the global economy, which has been the quest of the global corporatists for over 400 years, and they've been working at this for over 400 years, and I mean now they're in the final round. Their game of Monopoly has been building up to this crescendo. So the name of the game is basically for the nations to tell the private bankers that they have had their day, We need to burn every single bondholder there is. You know, people have bought into the bonds, the funds, whatever financial mechanism they've got, the CDs, the credit default swaps, that is, you know, whatever else they've got into them because they gambled. They gambled. And we know that Goldman Sachs has been abusing the small investor. And by small investor, I'm talking about anybody with 6 figures. Okay. Unless you had 7 figures, you were considered a small investor. And Goldman Sachs was fined $500 million a few years ago because they were caught red-handed, providing completely contradictory advice to the small investors than they were to the institutional investors. And the nature of the game in Goldman Sachs, and of course with the recent resignation of Greg Smith, who revealed that the culture of Goldman Sachs was to refer to the small investors as Muppets. And the nature of the game was to literally fleece the Muppets and pass those funds, which is effectively the middle classes, those funds into the hands of the institutions. And basically that's what's going to continue to happen until such time as the people actually say, like they did in Iceland, enough is enough. Enough's enough. You know, whatever it is you've got, and that's it. That's all you're getting. Because, you know, what's happened right now is the Irish government, and we can trace the moment that this occurred to the meeting in September 2008 when Brian Cowen and Brian Lenihan were effectively instructed by Paul Gallagher, who was a sitting Attorney General, and Dermot Gleeson, the Chief Executive of Allied Irish. Mm-hmm. And Cowen and Lenihan were effectively instructed to underwrite all Irish banks' liabilities by stating that they were underwritten by effectively the taxpayer. So what Cowen and Lenihan did in that one fell swoop was commit future Irish taxpayers to phenomenal levels of interest payments. So the bottom line is that Ireland has no chance, absolutely no chance of any recovery until such time as there is a fundamental change in direction, which basically means shutting down all of the current payments to the central banks, and literally Ireland starting up a new economy just like it did in the Icelanders did 3.5 years ago. Yes, of course, it's tough in the short term. It's very tough. But, you know, what happened is that the people in Iceland genuinely acknowledged that they were all in this together. I believe that the people of Ireland would acknowledge that, you know, they're all in this together, and they would find a way through it. And I mean, those that didn't want to, you know, sure, they can leave the country. What you need is people who are committed to restoring the true potential of Ireland as a great nation. And it has it. You know, Ireland, because of its location on the west of Europe, actually has 23% of all of the EU's fishing waters within its boundaries, within its national boundaries. But thanks to the pressure put on, well, pressure, probably no pressure at all, but thanks to corrupt Irish politicians, only 4% of those fishing waters can be used by Irish fishermen.
And I think that's something that most people don't realise. 23% of the fishing waters, yet we have given away 19% of that to other...
Well, you gave it away for one-off payment of €6 billion, which is horrendous. It's outrageous.
Amazing. I mean, that's only a drop in the ocean compared to what's going to bondholders and people who aren't actually owed any money.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. You know, and that's just the fishing. And like I said, you know, Raymond Crotty, 30-odd years ago, nearly 40 years ago, could see what was happening with the Common Agricultural Policy, and he could see that the intent was to destroy Irish farming and remove any possibility of Ireland being self-sufficient in terms of food production. And then we get on to the oil and gas, which is even more outrageous. Mm-hmm. You know, especially when you consider that the Nigerian government got a better deal for its people with Shell than the Irish government did when it effectively gifted Shell the licenses to produce the gas off the west coast. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, basically, the bottom line is Ireland needs a government that nationalises those resources, takes control of those resources, and utilises those resources for and on behalf of its people. A bit like Gaddafi did for 40-odd years. You know, people, if anybody believes the media depiction of Gaddafi, then unfortunately they are seriously deluded. You know, Gaddafi, whilst he may not have been a saint, he certainly has a lot less blood on his hands than the likes of Blair and Bush and even Cameron and Obama. And he was using the wealth that was generated by the natural resources, by the oil, and he actually restricted the output of Libyan oil to ensure that it was wealth that could be enjoyed by the country for many, many generations to come.
Yeah.
He didn't allow a policy of absolute rampant extraction, like which occurs in, say, Azerbaijan. But now that NATO have effectively removed Gaddafi, and of course in doing so, they also destroyed one of Gaddafi's most ambitious projects, which was to tap into the giant underground aquifers under the Northern Sahara, bring the water to the surface, and through a network of 7-foot concrete conduits, literally bring the water to the Northern Sahara. And the whole objective was to push the Sahara further south and turn that land into arable farmland. And Gaddafi's dream was that ultimately the Arab-African economy could be totally self-sufficient. Well, when the French started their bombing runs, very early on in the bombing campaign, they destroyed that conduit. And that conduit, by the way, only went on stream in September of 2010. They destroyed the conduit, and then a few days later, they destroyed the factory that produced the conduits. I mean, these are war crimes. These are out-and-out war crimes against a sovereign nation. And, of course, Tony Blair was guilty of preparing the ground, because if Gaddafi did have any sort of weapons of mass destruction, then Blair persuaded him to forego them so that Libya could be admitted back into the international community. When, of course, the objective the whole time was to ensure that the corporate globalists actually took control of Libya's resources. And because Gaddafi knew what their game was, the only way they were going to get control of Libya's resources was to take Gaddafi out of the equation. So, in Ireland, all it needed was a few brown paper bags and a few envelopes stuffed with goodness knows what to bribe certain politicians to hand it over.
Which is pretty pathetic when you think about it. And we know what the mainstream media can be like in terms of the picture that it paints. Most people, certainly in Ireland, would have up to recently considered that Gaddafi was evil, and he was this, he was this terrible, terrible despot who ruled with an iron fist over all his people. And the truth has actually refreshingly come to the fore since the, in my opinion, absolutely genocidal and despicable acts that were committed by NATO and France and Britain and the US and anybody else who may have aided them for nothing other than an issue of control and oil and money, as you have said. But what we're looking at, I mean, to me, that's a form of terrorism. It's not some guy hiding in a cave. It's a form of terrorism. But what you have described in Ireland, and by extension the rest of the EU or the Eurozone, is the same. It's financial terrorism. It's terrorism with a different gloss over the surface. In my opinion, the end game is the same.
Well, that's why we have these events. I mean, we're hosting this one in Ireland on Sunday at the Stillorgan Park Hotel. We have an advert for it in the Irish Times on Thursday, and the header across the top of the advert is, "Why can't Ireland do an Iceland?" Well, the reason Ireland can't do an Iceland is because Ireland doesn't have any politicians that are sufficiently courageous to challenge the global corporatists. I mean, there's been the odd politician, particularly within Sinn Féin, I have to say, who have challenged both the policies of Brian Cowen and of Enda Kenny. But the reality is that they're doing that from the back benches. And what's also interesting is that if it's known that they're going to give a speech challenging the policy to hand over this sovereign power to a foreign entity, Parliament empties. So they end up giving the speech effectively to an empty chamber.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is horrendous. I mean, I am shocked that so many politicians can be so easily bought. They have sold their soul. They are not looking after the best interests of the nation. In fact, the tragedy is, I believe that there's a very strong possibility that the Irish politicians actually do believe that they're acting on behalf of the best interests of the Irish people. But unfortunately, this only serves to illustrate their degree of financial illiteracy.
Absolutely. I think it's reflective of the type of people who are in power, which comes back to something you said at the beginning of the conversation as to the type of person who is attracted to politics and who is put before the electorate through the methods used by various political parties for selecting their candidates, and then we have the illusion of choice. So, I mean, we get to vote and we get to choose who we put in power, but we don't get to choose who we choose from, if that makes any sense.
No, of course you don't.
It's a paradigm. And do you think then, Ian, that politics, this can be changed through politics, or does it take something more radical? Or, for example, you've Johnny or you've Mary sitting at home in their house in Foxrock or in Stillorgan or in Ballymun or wherever it might be around the country, and they're sitting there and they're listening to us talking now, and they're saying, right, those two guys don't know what they're talking about. Conspiracy theory, there's nothing I can do, I'm powerless. What would you say to Johnny or Mary?
Okay, well, first of all, I would say, that if they absolutely dismiss everything we've discussed as pure conspiracy theory, then all I can do is encourage them to take a look at the evidence.
Yeah.
First of all, there's no excuse for people not to be informed today because, we have this wonderful tool. I'm not sure for how much longer, so let's make use of it. It's called the internet. Mm-hmm. So it gives people access to a phenomenal repository of information. Now, of course, there's a lot of crud on the internet. And it's absolutely essential that people practice the arts of discretion and discernment to be able to determine, what's good, genuine information and what's a complete crock of crap.
Yeah.
And that obviously takes some time and some practice. But can this thing be changed through politics? As you have just said, with the existing political paradigm, and particularly in Ireland, which has a culture of political dynasty, where seats tend to be passed down into the family. And, when one member retires or dies, then inevitably, if the son or the daughter steps into their shoes, that they start with a phenomenal advantage. So, Ireland has this culture of political dynasties, to some extent, very much like the US. We don't see the same sort of political dynasty within the families in the UK. But nonetheless, exactly the same situation is applied, as you described, when nobody gets into office unless they have effectively passed muster and are perceived to be a safe pair of hands, i.e. that they will do exactly what they're told. So can we change this through the political arena? Changing the political process has to be part of the game because there is no panacea here. There is no one thing that you can put your finger on and say, if we do this, then everything will be resolved.
Right.
Not at all. I mean, we have to focus on the education. We have to encourage people to understand what's occurring. We have to encourage people to have a desire to achieve some degree of financial literacy.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, I know different people have different capabilities and different capacities and different levels of interest. All we can do is ask people to absorb as much as they possibly can to understand, what's occurring here. And I think, that once the people understand, once it becomes in the consciousness, once there's a comprehension that basically the existing system not only isn't working, it is working. It's not working in the way they're told it should be working, but it is working because it's working to achieve the objective, which is to fleece them of everything that they've got.
Yes.
To fleece them of everything that they've busted their butt to accumulate in the course of their lives, or maybe even in the lives of their ancestors. And there is an agenda to remove it from them. And the bottom line is that no social change at any point in history, anywhere on the planet, has ever been brought about by the working classes. And my God, they've tried.
Yeah.
But when the working classes try to initiate social change, they get brutally beaten back. And of course, any quest for change is nipped in the bud. It is only when the middle classes realise that basically there is an agenda to fleece them, and they start to wake up to it and actually recognise that unless they do something about it, then everything that they have is going to be taken from them, and also they are condemning future generations to lives of absolute misery. then that can bring about change. And that's what we have to work to achieve. We have to work to spread the word, to get into the consciousness what's actually occurring, and then create the desire to bring about change. And I believe that once even corrupt politicians, once they realize that actually they're going to be out of a job because they're just not going to get elected, and I know, we still have the problem of rigged elections, etc., etc. But I mean, there comes a point where if the movement is so strong, it's nigh on impossible to rig the elections because everybody knows what the result should be.
Yes.
So there's no panacea here. There is no overnight solution. I mean, I don't see the Irish government anytime soon saying, you know what, we're going to do what Iceland did and we're going to tell the bondholders they can go whistle. I don't see that happening. It absolutely won't. If there's a massive no vote in the next referendum, it's a start.
I couldn't agree more. And I really think that the onus is on, this is my personal opinion, Ian, the onus is on the individual. So the onus is on me to take personal responsibility within my own life, for example. I think that's where it starts. Number one is to take back your individual power. So many of us assume that we have no power, and we look to the government or to our teachers or whoever it might be.
Or to the priest.
Or a priest, exactly, or whoever's in a perceived position of authority or power over us. We look to them to lead us. To me, that's bullshit. It's absolute nonsense. We're the ones with the power, and the only reason that these people have power, as it is perceived, is because we cede it to them. We give it to them. Literally, we give it to them through various means.
We give it to them in one of three ways, generally, and that's apathy, abdication, and our willful ignorance.
Well, there you have it in a nutshell. Absolutely. So I think the key for everybody, and I think that's what you're saying, is to take back that power, take your individual responsibility, and the collective consciousness or mindset or reality will shift as a result. Yeah?
Exactly. And like I said, anybody expecting a quick fix is going to be very, very disappointed. But my sense is, and I've been on this trail, if you like, now for 14 years. It's 14 years since I came out of the oil industry. Mm-hmm. And, I didn't really know necessarily how things were going to unfold. I just knew that I didn't want to be doing for the next 20 years what I'd been doing for the previous 20 years.
Right.
And when 9/11 went down, I already had enough background knowledge to know what 9/11 was all about. It took me 7 months to absolutely prove to myself beyond any shadow of doubt that 9/11 was an inside job. I don't profess to know exactly what occurred through every detail. What I do know is what didn't occur, because I've studied the evidence and I know where the evidence does not support the official version of events. So with 9/11, obviously then that really triggered my increased ardor with which I studied deep geopolitics. Yeah. And so, now for 11 years, nearly 11 years, I have been a full-time researcher, presenter, broadcaster on deep geopolitics, which is looking at the global agenda, looking at how all the dots are connected, how all the pieces of the jigsaw fit together, and show that nothing that occurs is random. 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, it is pre-planned, it is contrived, it doesn't always go according to their plan. And this is what is bringing about, I think, their downfall, because what's happening is as they become more desperate to establish their global government, they get sloppy. And for example, I mean, if absolutely anything happens at the London Olympics this year that isn't on the official schedule, be very, very suspicious. We have an event here. There's 49,000 military personnel going to be supplementing the normal policing. We have a helicopter carrier in the Thames. We have apartment blocks with anti-aircraft missiles on the roof. We have long-range sonic weapons on barges in the Thames. We have an 11-mile perimeter fence around the London Olympic Arena that can turn the whole area into a concentration camp in a heartbeat. We have full-body scanners being implemented to search people as they get into the Olympic area, and so on and so forth, to say nothing of the phenomenal level of CCTV, the facial recognition software. one of the concerns I have is that even if nothing happens at the London Olympics, then, the level of security that is introduced for the event becomes the norm. But, even things like that, I think, start to get people to question and go, hang on a goddamn second, what's really going on here?
And that's good, because people need to question that. This is a sporting event, supposedly. And what you've just described sounds like a war, or a war zone.
It's outrageous.
It's absolutely incredible. George Orwell's 1984 springs to mind.
Well, he didn't even get half of it. It was an incredibly prescient book. But, let's not forget that Zbigniew Brzezinski, writing his Between Two Ages in 1969, published in 1970, and everything that guy talks about, the technotronic control grid, the cashless society, where all transactions are monitored. Part of that is about making sure that nothing gets under the radar regarding taxation.
Yes.
But all transactions are monitored, that people's behavior is literally predictable based on recording every single movement they make. And that's where smart meters come in. Smart meters are all about hooking people into the total control grid, so that, every time you open your fridge, every time you take a product out, it can be recorded somewhere. Right now, some of the stores sell clothes with RFID chips in. I know which stores those are. One is Marks and Spencer's. Consequently, if I buy anything in Marks and Spencer's, I always make sure I use cash. Because otherwise, the RFID chip that's in that a clothing item is obviously linked electronically to the credit card or debit card that was used to purchase it. That information is then in the global control grid. So you've got a situation where eventually, sort of walking down the street, the RFID sensors could pick up the fact that you're wearing a T-shirt that was bought in Marks and Spencer's on such and such a date, and that it is linked to so and so who used their credit card to purchase it. Everything and all this stuff was being talked about 40 odd years ago, and now it's coming into being. It is really time for people to wake up and see the fact that we are literally allowing ourselves to be enslaved. It's being presented as advancements in technology. No, it's not. It's advancements in the control grid.
And I think each advancement comes back to your analogy of the frog in the boiling pot of water. We're drip-fed this technology and these developments. And in a sense, we're buying into our own enslavement, I think.
We are indeed. And the good news is that, more and more people are waking up to this. So let's bring this down to a sort of a positive ending, if you like.
Yeah.
Because, obviously we focused on everything that is occurring, and you are absolutely right, John. It is essential that people get involved, that they take responsibility, that they actually find a cause, and they get involved, and they work to bring about the changes that they want to see. But, another way of looking at this is that, it's only when we have deep personal trauma in our own lives that we are truly living. Because, the rest of the time, we're just existing. We go through a routine. We get up in the morning, put the kettle on, have a cup of tea, make the kids breakfast, get the kids off to school, go out the door, go to work, go through our routine at work, probably leave the brain in the locker room while we're at work, come home, make tea for the kids, sit down, have a brief chat with the kids, watch TV, have a beer, have a Guinness, whatever, go to bed. It's a routine. It's only when shit happens in our lives, all of a sudden we lose our jobs, or we have a relationship issue, or we have some other kind of financial issue, or somebody in the family, close family, is impacted in one of these ways. Then we actually have to stop and take stock, and we have to actually sort of reflect and think, oh my God, what is it in my life that I need to change to maybe get out of this mess and maybe avoid it happening again in the future? And, it maybe takes a bit of a while to work through it. Some of this stuff can take 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, years even, to work through. But when we work through it, ultimately we look back and we go, wow, shit, that was a hell of a ride, but I'm actually a better person because of that experience. And then, we get another period maybe of routine, and then, the universe or whoever sort of thinks, well, okay, it's time for another lesson, and whoom, the rug's pulled out from under us and off we go again. Well, fortunately, life isn't generally one sort of continuous line of trauma. We do get a bit of respite along the way. But consider what's happening now is exactly that, but on a macro basis.
Yes.
So this is humanity's opportunity to raise its game. And just like all games or all sporting pastimes, the only way you improve is to actually play against people who are better than you.
Of course.
And in terms of sort of global domination, those who think they're the rightful rulers of the planet have been doing this for a long time, a very long time. And they think they've got it mastered. But, they haven't reckoned on the fact that something is occurring. Humanity collectively is starting to wake up to their game. And it is my contention that whether they realize it or not, and the answer, of course, is probably not, they are actually doing us a massive favor because they're giving us a collective kick up the backside to say, look, you're actually capable of a lot more than this, but we're going to have to sort of force you into misery to get you to recognize it. Because it's only when you're completely beaten down and, you feel that the world's at an end that you actually rise to the challenge and come through it. So I actually think that, what's going on right now in terms of the longer term is really quite constructive. Because were it not for events like 9/11 or the London bombings, or even in Ireland, even with the Troubles, actually, in the early days of my research, I came across a lot of people, from Ireland and from the north who had done their own research into the Troubles and realized the degree of manipulation that was going on behind the scenes and realized that it wasn't quite like it was presented in the media and actually started to take an interest in the deeper machinations. So, that's now really what's occurring on a much, much larger scale.
Well, I think it comes down to, you mentioned macrocosms, and if each person sees himself as a microcosm of the world at large, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it might have been Gandhi who said, be the change that you wish to see in the world. And I think exactly that's probably the message that we're to take from this.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's another thing that we have to do as well, and that is, I think, we should also visualize the type of future that we want to see. I've been running a series of workshops over the past few months now called The Shift. And one of the things that, I look at in those workshops is I look at the scientific evidence that demonstrates that, we have enormous capability and capacity within each and every one of us.
Yes.
And there's a tremendous effort to shut that awareness down because those who think they're the rightful rulers of the planet do not want us to realize the full extent of our capability and capacity. Because if we do wake up to that, they are totally, totally screwed.
Personally, I believe that they will be, and I think that people will. I can see it myself in daily life. While there is much doom and gloom out there, I think there is an awakening, particularly amongst younger people. And I'm very pleased that you could join me to talk about that today, Ian, because it's the younger people who are the future. We are going to be the people who carry whatever happens forward in whatever capacity that may be. And I think any kind of an awakening or any access to information that people can provide others or discussions or anything like that, everything like that is positive in my opinion. And the more it really needs to change, but it starts with the individual. It starts with you, it starts with me, it starts with Johnny and Mary, who we spoke about earlier, and nobody should feel that they're going to be left behind or that they are not powerful or they're not insignificant, because we all start with a blank slate.
Absolutely right. And what you're doing with your radio shows, John, is absolutely a contributory factor in all of this.
Well, we'll keep fighting the good fight. And tell us more, first off, about the Stillorgan Park Hotel, because for anybody who might be interested in delving into further depth, they can do so in Dublin.
Yeah, it's going to be an event. It's going to be a massive event. We're really trying to reach out to people right across Ireland, which is why we're starting the event at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so that people can get an opportunity to get up at a reasonable hour and still get there. So it kicks off at 1 o'clock. Doors will open at 12. And who do we have there? Well, we have Thomas Sheridan, is a wonderful gentleman from Sligo, who's written a superb book called Puzzling People. And he's going to be talking about psychopaths in society and psychopathic behavior in the Dollarn. He's going to be followed by William Engdahl, who's written a superb book called Gods of Money. Then we have some guy called Ian R. Crane.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, you've heard of him? I've heard of him too. Anyway, he says he's speaking with a guy called Anthony Coughlin, who worked very closely with Raymond Crotty back in the 1970s.
Fantastic.
So it's going to be interesting to get his perspective on everything that's occurring. And then in the evening session, which will start at, I think, around about 7 o'clock, the evening session, we have Max Kaiser from Russia Today. And of course, Russia Today is one of the few news channels that actually tells the truth.
Yes.
I mean, who would have ever believed 30 years ago that we'd be talking about tuning to a Russian TV station to actually get the truth?
It's amazing.
There you go.
Amazing.
So Max Kaiser, along with his cohort Stacey Herbert, they'll be on first on Sunday evening, and then bringing the event to a close will be John Perkins, the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and the guy who has been working as a consultant with Iceland to help Iceland build the foundations for its economic recovery. So this, in my opinion, is, with possibly one exception, i.e. me, but I mean, it's a world-class lineup. And, these are people who have looked at the deeper agenda, people who, dare I say it, actually have a far greater comprehension of what's occurring than probably almost anyone in the Irish political arena today.
Amazing. It's going to be a top-class event. I'm really looking forward to it, and people can get details on tickets on my website, djjohngibbons.com, and pretty much all over the internet at the moment, and they can check out the advertisement in the Irish Times if they dare to buy such a publication on Thursday as well. Ian, tell us about your website before we let you go, and how people can learn more about you and subscribe to your newsletter and that kind of thing. Okay,
well, I have a number of ways. I also publish 2 magazines, which have I've only been publishing them since the beginning of the year. They're both produced, they're both edited in New Zealand, but they are absolutely essential global information. One is called Uncensored Magazine.
Yep.
That's been running for 6 years in New Zealand, but we're now into the 2nd issue in Europe, and that covers everything and anything that won't be addressed by the mainstream media. And the website for that one is uncensoredmag.co.uk.
Uncensoredmag.co.uk.
Yeah, and then we have the New Zealand Journal of Natural Medicine. We have legislation in Europe now, which, of course, I've been talking about for many years. I've been saying it was coming, and I was dismissed as a rampant conspiracy theorist. Mm-hmm. And yet, on the 1st of May last year, a wonderful piece of legislation was introduced in the EU called THUMPT,
yes,
which stands for the Traditional Herbal Medicines Products Directive, which basically means that by April the 30th of next year, 2013, all natural herbal medicinal products must be removed from shelves in the EU unless they have been specifically approved. And of course, the approval process is so outrageously expensive that very few companies can afford it, with the exception of Big Pharma.
Yeah.
But there's similar legislation going down in New Zealand, but this magazine is absolutely outstanding in terms of looking at natural health processes from around the world. The New Zealand Journal of Natural Medicine, the website is nznaturalmed.co.uk.
Okay.
And then finally, my own website is ianrcrane.com, ianrcrane.com, and that's where people can find out where I'm speaking and DVDs that I've been releasing over the years. And, many of the DVDs that I produced in like 2006 and 2007, I mean, they're still on sale because everything I talked about in those 5 and 6 years ago, everything I talked about has unfortunately come to pass. And I don't claim any special insight. I simply read the scripts.
Ian, give us a final message for the listeners before you go.
The final message is everything that's going on in the world right now is like a cancer. And if you don't do anything about it, you know what the end result's going to be. And it isn't going to be very pretty. But if you actually take the time, take the trouble to do some research, and don't just accept the mainstream solution of chemotherapy or whatever the equivalent is, mm-hmm. but you actually do your research and you look at alternatives. Many people are starting to realize that there are ways in which they can fight cancer which are far less obtrusive than the methods being put forward by the establishment. They don't need to subject themselves to chemotherapy and radiotherapy and the like. There are natural ways of resolving the problem. And we have exactly the same going on right now in the world. What we have is a cancer. The solution that's being put forward by the establishment is designed effectively to kill us. So, we have to find alternatives. Those alternatives are out there. And, when we find the way, let's consider it a challenge. Let's rise to the challenge. And when we come through the other side, we're going to look back and we are going to say it was a hell of a ride. But my God, it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. I actually believe that those who think they're the rightful rulers of the planet are fighting a rearguard action right now. They're becoming desperate. And what I do without anger, I do without fear. I just point out what is. I don't expect anybody to take anything I say at face value. I simply encourage people to take a look at this for themselves, to come to their own realization of what's going on, because it's only then that it becomes their truth. But between us all, I know we're going to win the day, and I know that eventually we are going to provide a better opportunity for the coming generations.
I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. Ian R. Crane, it's been a great pleasure having you on today and speaking to you today. We'll speak to you very, very soon, I hope. Thank you once again.
Thanks, John. I much appreciate it.
Alchemy Radio.
Alchemy Radio.
tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave